just give me an overview of your work? What does the invention of the white race mean?
Yes, it's actually the work of Theodore W. Allen, right? I write about Allen. I have his papers, which I'm indexing and inventorying. And Allen's basic argument, for people who are not familiar with it, is as follows. He wrote two books on that subject, two-volume work in 1994 and 1997, and they've been reprinted by Verso Books about 4 months ago, in late 2012, and I did a lot of the new supplemental material for it. And on the back cover of the first volume, Allen wrote that when the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, there were no white people there, nor would there be for another 60 years. And he points out, and he did this, Allen was an autodidact, a self-educated, working class, intellectual, anti-white supremacist scholar. And he spent over 20 years going through primary records in Virginia. So he bases his statement, when he says there are no white people there, he's pointing to the fact that the word white doesn't appear in any Virginia colonial records until 1691. And he went through 885 county years of records. That is, you take the counties that existed at that time in Virginia, all the records for 1 year is a county year. And so it's very thorough research he did. And the word doesn't appear. And it's not simply that the word doesn't appear, as we know it, it's a symbol of social status, but he argues, based on the records, that the white race as we know it was not functioning. And when I say based on the records, he went through the records, but he's a working class person, and he's looking from that eye. So he paid particular attention to wherever men or women, African, European, had a voice in any hearings, in any colonial record. And he actually went to these county courthouses and to the Virginia State Library and transcribed these, and then he'd come back and type them up at night. And these are all these records. I have thousands of pages, right? And he argues that the word didn't appear, but the white race wasn't functioning. And he goes through all different areas of civil life, civilian life. And
now let me jump in just a second.
Sure.
Now, you're saying the word white doesn't appear.
Right.
So after the name, what would it say, like English or?
Well, it might just have someone's name. Or in the case of John Punch, I used this example recently. There was a lot of attention paid some months ago when it was found out that Barack Obama was related to a man named John Punch, who ran away with two cohorts in 1640. They were all trying to escape their bondage, right? Their limited term bond servitude. And he runs away, and the two people he runs away with in that record, he's not described. John Punch is described as Negro, and he runs away with Victor, a Dutchman, and a Scotsman named James Gregory. So it could be English, could be Dutch, could be Scottish. Most of the people were English in the colony. There weren't so many Africans in this early period. The big turn to African labor only begins in Virginia, and Virginia is the pattern-setting plantation colony. That's why it's so important. I think 7 of the first 12 presidents come from Virginia. So the Royal African Company is founded in the 1670s, and still for the remainder of the century there are more European than African bond laborers coming into the U.S. So people oftentimes are not familiar with that. At the time of Bacon's Rebellion, which is another account where a fellow named Thomas Grantham puts down the big joint struggle of European and African American laborers, he talks about encountering English and Negroes in arms, ready to cut them up and chop them to pieces and demanding their freedom from bondage. And they're joint because they're all chattel bond servants. At the time of Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, 3/4 of the chattel bond servants in Virginia were European American.
Before you go on,
Sure.
can you define what the chattel bond?
Well, a chattel bond servant is someone in the early period, and chattel bond servant isn't brought from England. Again, England had gone through centuries of struggle from people from below, and in 1563 the established labor law for England, which was to prevail for the next 250 years, Statute of Artifices, was formulated and passed, and two key provisions where there would be no slavery and workers would be paid wages, right? And that's what the colonists from England brought when they found Jamestown in the early 1600s. And that's what's the law in Virginia. Until roughly 1622, there were some intermediate forms They turned to tobacco in 1616. That's the big cash crop which the plantations start to really, get built to produce, right? But in 1622, in 1619, 1620, there were some efforts to take advantage of vulnerable populations in England and ship them to Virginia under more oppressive conditions. There's maids for wives. There are women who are brought, to get matched with men, and there's duty boys who are youngsters, who are supposed to serve for a while, before they'll be free. But the basic relations of production, if you will, in Virginia in this early period are typical capitalist relations of production. And for the laborers at the bottom of society, that means tenants at halves, where they keep half of what they produce and they turn over half, or wage laborers. But on 22nd March 1622, there's a major attack on the Jamestown settlement by the Powhatan Native Americans in the area. And they wipe out 1/3 of the colony in one day. And within the next year, another third dies. And it's very precarious existence now for the colonists. They can't even go very far beyond the confines of the fort to grow, and there are actually laws passed prohibiting growing of corn, which is the main thing they ate, because it could provide cover, for people ready to attack. So it puts the laboring people who have nothing and don't really have access not only to land and tools, but they don't have access to supplies to live on. So it puts them in a very vulnerable position. And the ruling elite in Virginia at that time do what we have seen over the next few centuries. It's Naomi Klein talks about implementing kind of a shock doctrine. They impose a new category of labor on these laboring people who are free wage earners or tenants at half. And it's chattel bond servitude, right? And I'll explain exactly what that is in a second. But chattel is property, right? And bond servitude, people now being forced to serve 3, 4, 5 years at first, like that, when they can try and get away with extending it to 6 or 7 years in the case of women or Irish, they would do it, right? But chattel, and this is a qualitative change from England. In the Virginia records, you'll see it referred to as the, quote, custom of the country, right? A lot of people in this country have been taught in the schools, oh, they are indentured servants, right? And they sign, as if they signed indentures in England. This is being imposed in Virginia by a ruling elite on a vulnerable, mostly European population as the custom of the countries. It is not a feudal carryover. It's not a carryover from feudalism. In feudalism, there's a two-way bondage. Serf has responsibility to the lord, and the lord has responsibility to serf. This is a one-way bondage in which the bondservant can be bought and sold like property. They have, right? So it's qualitatively different, imposed primarily on European Americans at first. It's limited term chattel bond servitude is what Allen describes it as, and very accurately. And it really begins in large scale from 1622 on. And throughout the 17th century in Virginia, and that's the principal, as I said, plantation colony at that time, the majority of the laboring population and the majority of people who come to Virginia come as, they're chattel bond servants. Again, people are not familiar with that. And the African American population is still relatively small, as I said, but conditions for chattel bond servants were very oppressive. A lot of them didn't live out there 3, 4, or 5 years. And so there was much similarity. And for African Americans and European Americans, they did what normal people would do under those conditions. They fought together, they ran away together, they resisted, they made love, they functioned as normal human beings. Conditions were also particularly oppressive for women in that period, and there were laws, because again, a more vulnerable group, and there'd be harsher penalties on some things. In this early period, when it's limited chattel bond servitude, there are also laws against fornication or adultery. People are not allowed to have these relations because if a woman gets pregnant, that's time off from work, right? You only have 5 years, so particularly when you have limited term bond servitude. So these were violations, punishable by whippings and, sentencing to extra servitude and things like this. And Allen pays particular attention to these things. And throughout his book, his antennas are up on questions of white supremacy as it develops, on male oppression. I think readers will find much in here, and I've tried to make it a point in the index to help point them to a lot of material. And in new editions of the books, we have have 25-page internal study guides in each volume. But what I just mentioned about the fornication and adultery, Allen treats these as forms of resistance in this early period. It's very interesting, as well as petitioning in court, things where, the avenues that people had to resist. Later on, and I mentioned in a very significant case, which it's good for, I think, students of labor history to be aware of, is the Elizabeth Key case. And very briefly, Elizabeth Key is a woman whose father was European, mother was of African descent, and she's a limited-term bond servant. And there was some question, her parents die, and the people who had title to her service, right, wanted to extend her to lifetime bond servitude. Again, if they'll try and extend things when they can. And she goes into court using the right of petition, right, which was available. She's African American by our definition. Well, she is African American. And she goes to court and petitions on two grounds. She had been baptized, and there was some tradition where baptism meant people could not be sentenced to lifetime bond servitude. But the other thing that she argues is that it's English common law. Partus sequitur, forgive my Latin, patrum. Descent follows the status of the father. And that's the common law in England for centuries. And she prevails. She prevails, right? But 6 years later, Virginia, the plantation owners say, this isn't the way we want to go, because later on, particularly as they turn to racial slavery, they want those children of these women who are being taken advantage of by owners or overseers or whatever, they want their children to be lifetime bond servitude. So there's a qualitative change, and they switch in 1662, descent following the status of the father to descent following the status of the mother. It's a qualitative change in laws, which people who study family and gender relations in this country should know. I mean, this is very, very significant. And that's how it went in Virginia. So what happens now under these similar conditions, and there's a historian named Lerone Bennett Jr., who people may be familiar with. He was senior editor of Ebony magazine for many, many years. He wrote Before the Mayflower, which a lot of people in the 70s, 80s, and 90s were familiar with. One of his early books is The Shaping of Black America, Chapter 3. And in that book, he describes, not with all the primary sources that Allen had, but I don't think Bennett had access to all the primary sources that Allen did. He describes conditions very similar to what Allen describes, how conditions were very similar for European American, not great conditions, right? They're pretty oppressive, but there was much commonality of experience. And between 1660, when the price of tobacco takes a dive, and 1676, when Bacon's Rebellion starts, there are over 10 laboring class and bond servant revolts in Virginia, right? So it's a period of increased turmoil and labor solidarity. And so what Allen then argues, whereas there was no white race in the beginning and people were not identified as white, they were English, French, Angolan, sometimes Negro, sometimes Angolan, it depends on who's writing the records too. Allen argues that after Bacon's Rebellion, in Bacon's Rebellion, it starts out, I won't go into great detail on this, but Allen does, as a struggle between the elite and the sub-elite over the rate of expropriation of the Native American population. Essentially, as is so often the case, the ruling elite likes things the way they are, and they actually try to maintain friendly relations with neighboring Native American tribes because they would help control runaways, right? They would have agreements on that. Whereas the new plantation owners on the make, the up-and-coming plantation owners, they wanted more access to land to expand plantations and larger plantations. So they took a much more aggressive policy. So Bacon's Rebellion starts as an elite, sub-elite struggle over rate of expropriation of land from Native Americans. But in the latter stages, the second Civil War stages, it turns into, as often happens, a struggle which engages the people from below, and that's those who make up Bacon's army. Bacon dies, but they go on and they push their demands, the chattel bond servants and free laborers supporting them, demanding freedom from bondage, one of the principal demands. And in Bacon's Rebellion, they kick out the governor, they burn Jamestown, and the rebels control 6/7 of the colony for about 9 months. It's a very significant struggle. In the wake of that, the ruling elite decides they have to devise a means of social control. Two of Allen's main themes in his work are that the capitalists in this case, the plantation bourgeoisie, have two principal tasks. They want to make money, they want to make profit, but they have to maintain social control. And he focuses particular attention on how they maintain social control. Volume 1 of his 2-volume work is Racial Oppression and Social Control, right? So it's central to his understanding, and he thinks that's a key to understanding what happens. So in the wake of Bacon's rebellion, and this is Allen's main thesis, he says that the plantation bourgeoisie in Virginia invented the white race as a ruling class social control formation, right? It serves ruling class interests. It's coming from above to serve their interest. And then he goes on, he's got two corollaries. One is that they did this by implementing a system of racial privileges extended towards the European Americans, white race privileges. And at the same time, they instituted they started developing a system of racial oppression. And he makes some clear distinction on what he means by racial oppression. The title of his 2nd volume, which details this, is The Origin of Racial Oppression in Anglo-America. And when he talks about racial oppression, what is key to racial oppression is how social control is maintained, and it is by laboring people of the oppressor group over the oppressed, in this case, what we would call a race, right? The oppressed race. As opposed to in the Caribbean, what develops, for instance, is a key ingredient in social control are from the oppressed group, right? Because the demographics are very different history of class struggle. He goes into all of this. But so Allen says the corollary was that the white race is invented by implementing a system of racial privileges and developing a system of racial oppression. Very key to the racial oppression was not only the lifetime bond servitude of African Americans, not all of them, though, of overwhelming majority, but the attacks on free African Americans, which I'll get into in a second. That's crucial to understanding racial oppression. But the third point he makes, which is so important and so distinguishes his work and is so central, I think, for labor history, is that not only was this system of racial oppression and racial slavery harmful for African Americans across the board, right? But that it was also ruinous to the interest of laboring class European Americans, right? Clearly he sees it's in the interest of the ruling elite. But for laboring people, this was not the way to go. What was far better was that solidarity between European Americans and African Americans. But what the plantation elite was able to do in Virginia when they created this white race was to, and then they had to propagandize it. They put it on the church. He details again all of this. They put it on the church doors, and the sheriffs are posting it, the means of mass communication of the day, and they're constantly indoctrinating people in it. And there's penalties for doing things. It's a process. One of the key steps in it. Yeah, I'm sorry. There's some legislation, 1705 and 1723. Moving too much?
When you put your hands in the middle there, you grab the wire.
I'm sorry. Did I knock it out?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
If you can handle the wire at all, you're
Yeah.
good to go. If you want to put it on your side,
Okay.
see how it's hanging straight down, right?
Yeah.
No, just have it.
Okay. I'm sorry. It's tough not getting impassioned. I'm sorry.
And we want you to be. Now, I don't want to stop your train, but I want you
Yeah,
to go a little
sure.
more into, while you're there, like if I understand what you're saying, the propaganda part of it, they
Yeah.
have to indoctrinate people with their concepts so that they identify,
Right.
like, so that even the
White identity is nothing natural. I mean,
Right.
people were not white. Are we on? We taping?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Allen's very clear. The push for the invention of the white race and the push for racial slavery was coming from the plantation bourgeoisie. He says this was not a demand coming from the European American laboring people, right? And he goes through instance after instance. And what I would encourage people to do is really engage his work. It's a life's work. It's his magnum opus. It's 800 pages. It's 35% documented, primary source footnotes, notes. It's a major work, and what I appreciate about Allen's work, amongst other things, and I'm a historian, is that he works outside the academy. He's an independent scholar, and I call it good independent proletarian scholar. So he has great integrity in his work, and even when he knows what the counter arguments are, so he tries to raise them in their best light and then address them in a serious and meaningful way, right? And so for people who are interested in matters of race and class, I think it's a wonderful building block, for any future work. Already, if people go to my webpage, I have almost 60 quotes from scholars and activists, which are staggering in terms of their praise of Allen, and very important scholars already referring to the work as a classic. It's a classic. And it's just the task is to get more people to engage it and become familiar with it, because I'm quite convinced it's a major building block for understanding U.S. labor history. What I wanted to speak about before for a second, aside from the point that Allen makes, I think rather convincingly, that this demand was not coming from the laboring class European Americans, is the two main arguments. When he's arguing that it's ruinous to the interest also of European American workers as well as to African Americans, he winds up taking on two main arguments. And these arguments are crucial, I think, in terms of labor history and in terms of working people, understanding their own history and struggling forward. And he takes on what are the two main arguments that undermine struggle against white supremacy by European Americans. And the two main arguments are, one, that racism, whatever we call it, white supremacism, is innate. Because if it's innate, why would we fight against it? It's always going to be that way. Be the same if, if a shoe was on the other foot. Well, all these arguments. And the second argument is that white workers, quote, benefit from white supremacism or racism. And if they benefit from it, why should they oppose it, right? And those are the two main arguments. And I've 33 years actively in the trade union movement and continue to be active as a retiree. And I've been raising this issue for all that time. And I'm pretty familiar with what the arguments are and what we have to go against. And Allen, one of his major contributions is to historically challenge both those. Now, in terms of history of the colonial period, where those arguments appear, the first argument about racism is innate is in the work of Winthrop Jordan, who's a historian who wrote a book in the late 60s, White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards the Negro, 1550 to 1812, I believe, National Book Award and several other prizes. And it's the ideological response to the civil rights, black liberation struggle of the 60s. This is the counter. All this doesn't matter. Racism's innate, right? And he calls it an unthinking decision. The second argument is more sophisticated because it comes in its most articulate form from a fellow named Edmund S. Morgan, professor emeritus from Yale, a well-respected historian, president of the Organization of American Historians, and he writes a very important book, American Slavery, American Freedom, which covers much of the same ground that Allen does and does a very good job on it. This is not a mean-spirited attack on Morgan, but at key point, Morgan argues there were too few free poor to matter in Virginia. Europeans, poor Europeans. And that is not the case. And we've always had, historically, we've had poor whites, if you will, down south. That is the case where the other person I run on, Hubert Harrison, comes from St. Croix. That's the case in St. Croix. That's the case in Jamaica, in Barbados, in the Anglo-Caribbean. And Allen makes distinctions. That's why he refers to what develops here as racial oppression and there as national oppression. So those are the two arguments that Allen is taking on. Now, one other thing I want to mention is on the unthinking decision, because ultimately, that's really a key one, because that's the one everybody's been so ingrained within this, and to think in terms of phenotype, so Virginia passes laws implementing this, continually moving towards the development of this white race. And one of the laws they pass is it takes away the right to vote for free African Americans, right? There's still free African Americans in Virginia. Even in England, they don't understand. And they write back to the colony and say, why are you doing this? These people aren't, they should be able to vote. And so Gooch, a fellow named Gooch, is the governor of Virginia, so he has to break it down to them how we do things here, And he writes, well, we did this to fix a perpetual brand on free Negroes and mulattoes. And Allen, after he documents all this in details, he says, surely that was no unthinking decision, which is Jordan's phrase, right? So again, this is very important. Now, another important ingredient of Allen's work, and it starts from this early analysis, and he goes back to the English roots, and the development of capitalism in England, in the 1400s, 1500s, the enclosures, the closing of the monasteries, the struggles, and then how Virginia gets set up on a capitalist basis, tobacco production. And so one of his major theses, which is a major break from traditional U.S. labor history, is his understanding that slavery is capitalism, slaveholders are capitalists, and the chattel bond laborers, European or African American, are proletarians. The notion of enslaved black labor as proletarians has been one that has been run through very many famous black intellectual activists. Allen initially took his insights from W.E.B. Du Bois, and one of his major unpublished works is called The Kernel and the Meaning, and it's drawn from Du Bois's a passage in Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, a 1935 book which reshaped a lot of our understanding of U.S. labor history. And in that work, Du Bois writes that the white labor movement never had the intelligence to see in black slavery and Reconstruction the kernel and the meaning of the labor movement, right? Before Du Bois does that, Hubert Harrison, the fellow I write about, who's the outstanding black radical of the early 20th century radical intellectual, is called the father of Harlem radicalism. And he, for a while, was the leading black activist in the Socialist Party. And he similarly, back in the journals, in major theoretical pieces in the socialist press, describes the black labor as the ultimate exploited, kind of the quintessential proletarians, right? C.L.R. James. And in an article I've written, The Developing Conjuncture and Insights from Hubert Harrison and Theodore W. Allen on the centrality struggle against white supremacy, I go through a number of these famous writers and authors and historians of the South, Gray, Phillips, a number of people who all are very clear this is capitalism. And if this is capitalism, Allen then goes to the next step. If this is capitalism, if the slave owners are capitalists or the plantation owners are capitalists, and the labor force is chattel bondage, are proletarians, maybe not originally, maybe the original, but they're reduced to this status, right? And this is what's now imposed. Then that redoes so much of labor history. And amongst other things, what it does is it provides us an opening to understand and see both the centrality of the African American struggle to our general struggle in this country, but the key role that African American laborers have played in labor history in this country. It tears the cover off many white labor betrayals of black labor, particularly a lot of when I was growing up, a lot of the history I was being fed, U.S. labor history was starting in the early 1800s to the birth of the labor movement, but black workers were outside the labor force, so it wasn't really a betrayal when the European American workers didn't support abolition or anything like that. Of course, black laborers supported abolition. They didn't have any problem supporting it. Or in England, the Chartists, supported the labor class movement, right? Supports abolition, but this assumption that somehow it was not in European American laborers' interest to support African American. So it tears the covers off. But another important point that Allen makes is that it's only by going back to the colonial period that we can understand the origin of this white race thing, right? And that it's very important for us in our generations now to understand this and to see it for what it is, a ruling class social control formation. And the only way that that can be understood, he's arguing, is to go back to see how it's set up and for what purposes, right? For ruling class social control. And he's really posing a challenge to what he calls the great white assumption. Just an assumption that this white thing always exists, that there's something to it, and that it's just there, it's automatic, and and I'll just say a little more on that, and not that. Hubert Harrison, who I write on, back in 1911 in the Socialist Party press, led in a campaign amongst the socialists at first to write the word Negro with a capital N, right, and to use that word as opposed to racial epithets and lowercase n. And Socialist Press wasn't doing it. They wound up doing it within a year or two on his prodding. By 1931, I think it is, the New York Times starts doing it. It both, amongst other things, it poses a challenge to white supremacy, but it's also a self-assertion thing, right?
What year was this
Well, the Times is 30-31, I think. Harrison does it in 1911 in the Socialist Party Press, 1912. And then when I grow up, in the period I grow up, 1960s, in that struggle of civil rights struggle, black liberation struggle, there's a move away from Negro, right? It's a new generation, new period, and they're posing a challenge. And there's move to black, African American, African, variations, but they move away from Negro again as a progressive step forward, and helping to push the struggle forward. I'm pretty clear, I myself, that there's nothing positive in identifying as white. And we have to challenge. What does that mean? What is it? Again, my experiences, and I've been fighting, affirmative action issues, lots of issues related to this for many years. But in the early 1970s, some of the main cases that we used to challenge affirmative action, the Bakke and the Weber case, Weber in terms of labor, Bakke in terms of admissions, college admissions, are premised on this notion of white rights, right? I think it's all got to be challenged. And I think for European Americans, as part of the struggle against white supremacy, we want to understand the origins of the term, the concept, what this thing is. Allen also, just to distinguish him from some other people, in the academy now, he's the founder of the notion of white privilege, but Allen's notion of white privilege is rooted in race and class analysis in the 1960s. He writes pamphlets which shake SDS. National SDS winds up declaring an all-out national challenge to white skin privilege in 1969. New York Times has a feature article on it. But this is not the white skin privilege many people today know. If you go to Wikipedia today, you'll believe that white skin privilege starts with the invisible knapsack and Peggy McIntosh in 19... it's got its origins many years before, and it's rooted in race and class analysis, right? When Allen writes the second volume of the Invention of the White Race, it's the origin of racial oppression in Anglo-America. He emphasizes singular origin, like Darwin does the origin of species, or Engels, the origin of the family. He goes, the singularity is important because it emphasizes my message that the origin of racial oppression is in class struggle. It's a ruling, it's crucial to labor history, right? So I think these are all important things for people to think about, because this is a long struggle, and I think we're far from where we want to be in it, right? So we've got to fight on many fronts, and what I try and do, in my own life and with the people I function with, we try and challenge class domination, we try and gender oppression, but in particular focus on white supremacism because I believe it's so crucial to how the ruling class maintains control in this country. And you fight it in practice, you fight it ideologically, historically, in all these areas. You fight these struggles. One other thing about Allen's work that I think is important for labor history, and this is, again, these are in the articles I write about him, but all of this is on my webpage so people can find, and they can find his original documents. But when he first sets out, he doesn't start out writing about the invention of the white race. He's trying to address the question, how do we explain the relatively low level of class consciousness in this country compared to particularly other European capitalist countries? And he reviews the previous labor history and labor historians by left and labor historians and general historians. He argues that they put together a general consensus, a six-pronged rationale, and he goes through each of the six prongs, the heterogeneity of the workforce, the free land safety valve, he goes through these things. And he argues that each and every one on close inspection is shown to be shaped deeply by white supremacy and more myth than reality. The free land wasn't really going to laboring people, the railroads were gobbling up, whatever issue we look at. And heterogeneity, rather than being a weakness, maybe was a strength in many ways, right? And so he goes through all that, which is an important thing. But then he looks at, and this is crucial, he looks at the three previous major crises in U.S. history. Those of the 1870s, the 1890s, and the 1930s, when laboring people and people at the bottom of society began to come together to push for changes from below. And he makes the very important argument that in each and every one of those periods of struggle, what the ruling class did, what they turned to beat back struggle from below, was appeals to white supremacy. Now, I'll give examples from the Depression because I think they're very clear and they're more recent. But if we look at the Depression, we look at a fellow named Ira Katznelson up at Columbia University has written a book, When Affirmative Action Was White. And he basically makes the argument that each and every federal program from the 1930s into the 60s was shaped in a white supremacist fashion. So if we look at the the labor legislation, National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, even Social Security until 1951, they're all shaped in a white supremacist fashion. Why and how? They exclude domestic and agricultural workers. That's 75% of your black labor force down south, right? 60% nationwide. You look at relief, it's federal money, but it's controlled locally. Meant great disparities down south. We right here, as we do this interview, are in the New York area. Another big thing was the GI Bill. Under the GI Bill, you can get a home with zero down payment and low interest loan. Statistics for the New York, North Jersey area are 67,000 GI loans were awarded. Less than 100 go to families of color. That's how you get the ring of white suburbs around New York and every other city in this country. And the fourth one, which I would love to see more labor historians and students of labor history pay attention to, is, I think, crucial. And that is the unemployment ratio. As long as I've been alive, as long as anyone in this room has been alive, the black to white unemployment ratio has been 2 to 1 or some variant of that, right? But it wasn't always that way. In 1929, at the start of the Great Depression, the black to white unemployment ratio was 1 to 1, which makes sense if you think about it, because black people are brought here to labor, right? It's only after those programs of the New Deal and the post-war employment stuff that by 1947, the black to white unemployment ratio is 2 to 1, and it's basically remained that way in some close variant ever since. There's much more to this analysis, but it's again, in Allen's work and in my work on Allen, I cite people to the original sources.
I think this is very important to our story. We spoke to a guy yesterday, Timothy Messer-Cruz,
Yes.
who kind of alluded to the same thing. He feels that the reason labor is in the state it is because, I guess from the 30s onward, maybe before that, that labor did not embrace African Americans. And do you have any more thoughts on that in more of the current eras?
Well, I think that's the case. I think it's from before the Depression also. I mean, that's the big, when Allen's last book was Toward a Revolution in Labor History, and he starts paying particular attention going back through all the 19th century and how labor, how the and Workingmen's Association didn't support abolition, how the National Labor Union didn't support demands coming out of the Black South in Reconstruction period. He goes through all of this, and my work is focusing on the 20th century, on Hubert Harrison and the Socialist Party gets into that. But I think in terms of current struggles, I am very convinced that the struggle against white supremacy is central to struggle in this current period, as it has been historically. We want European American workers to identify as workers, not as whites, right? We want to emphasize the worker, and we want to break from that white thing, because the white thing serves ruling class interest, right? Now, I did 33 years in the post office, and I have on my webpage, and it was posted someplace. I've got actually lots of material which I have to write on, and I can speak from the postal experience as one concrete example. But first I want to talk about the work we did in the post office. And from the early 80s on, for a pretty lengthy period, I was elected head of one of the unions at a big 4,000 worker postal facility in Jersey City, the Bulk Mail Center. Big facility, mixed workforce, and Jersey City, working class town, mile in perimeter, big factory. It's a big factory. And we waged campaigns, and we're putting out bulletins every week. We set up committees. We got the Women's Committee, the Grievance Committee, the Health and Safety. But every issue we looked at came from this perspective, which I learned from Hubert Harrison, the other person I write about. And every issue we looked at, how is white supremacy shaping this issue? Because there's not an issue you can touch in the workplace or in society in U.S. where white supremacy is not a shaping factor in that. In my longer article, I go through, every area: employment, healthcare, life expectancy, incarceration. We can go over them. And what Hubert Harrison, whose biography I'm completing the second volume on now, that early 20th century activist, he wrote way back in 1912, 100 years ago. He goes, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. And a touchstone is an extraordinary metaphor because a touchstone is a black stone. You rub it against gold to see if the metal is really what it's supposed to be. And any issue we look at in society, I think we want to approach from that perspective. We want to look. In the workplace, we'd look at discipline. Two workers, same offense. Black worker might get they get a 2-week suspension. White worker gets a 1 week, right? The light duty work for pregnant women. The black women treated much more harshly than the European American women, right? Every issue we looked at, health, work conditions in the workplace, it's not hard to find. I mean, we fight, on behalf of working people on all these issues, but you have to be aware that there's this other element shaping it, and you have to, as a central part of your work, go after it. And what happened when we were working in the post office, this was new to a lot of people, like some people are talking this, and there was a lot of eyes, and are people really, is this for real? How long is this going to last? Because sometimes when you came to questions like overtime, workers oftentimes really live for that extra money they get from their overtime. They're 2 hours here, they're 2 hours there. But we had a pattern where it was clearly white supremacist distribution of overtime. And we challenged that. And people were ready to come to blows at first, right? And people will look at it. How long is this going to last? But when we do that, and when you do it consistently, when I worked in the bulk mail center, payday was every other Thursday. So we made sure our bulletins came out on Thursdays because we knew most people would be there to read it, right? At least every other Thursday. And but we were steady. It wasn't we waited for incidents and then we got to jump, through the roof about, oh, look what happened here or there. We were steady, making it part of everybody's life. So it's wonderful work. I think we led the statewide we helped coordinate the statewide anti-apartheid struggles. In Jersey City, which is racially polarized, like parts of New York, parts of Brooklyn, people may be familiar with, and things like this, Jersey City, Bayonne, there's a lot of racial polarization. At one point, we had 3,000 out of 4,000 workers in this facility wearing anti-apartheid buttons. It was staggering. It is possible. So I think it's possible to do this. I think this is the key to moving forward because I think the analysis that Harrison hints at, that Alan describes in more detail about white supremacism, racism, however it's being called, being the major retardant to class consciousness in this country is true. We've got to deal with it. We're not getting any place unless we deal with it, any place significant. And I think it can be done. So I'm very optimistic, and I base it on practical experience. Now, one other thing I want to use just to enlighten listeners, another example of how the ruling class turns to white supremacy in response to labor struggle. I was in the Postal Service. I was involved in the 1978 strike. This is parenthetical to the main point, but I'll just point out in 78, a couple of years, 2.5 years before PATCO, we had a few hundred people get fired for striking against the Postal Service. That was under the Democrat Jimmy Carter. So everybody talks about Reagan and the attack on PATCO, but you get it from the Democrats sometimes too, right? More than sometimes. And but the point is, the big strike was 1970, and the big postal strike of 1970 was keyed in the inner cities of Chicago and New York. And it was particularly, Chicago had a very high percentage black and Latin workers in their workforce, as did New York, very high. And back then, Wall Street ran on paper. Business Week did a 28-page special. What's going on here? Because they couldn't get their paper to run. And Nixon's the president, and he's catching hell, right? Nixon is catching hell. So the ruling elite has got to do something about this. To make the story a little short, what their response was, there were several aspects of it. One is Nixon sets up a Postal Board of Governors to act as a buffer between, because he was directly had answerable at that time. So now he has somebody he can blame, the Board of Governors, right? That's one thing he does. A second thing they do is they recognize certain unions. As a matter of fact, to make it more complicated for organizing, the one union they don't recognize, the one group that wants representation rights, is the National Alliance of Postal and Federal Employees, which is a 99% black organization that had started in 1913 when Woodrow Wilson became president and segregated federal workplaces, a number of federal workplaces, and a lot of other things. And they'd been around. So they didn't recognize them, but they recognized the rural letter carriers, the American Postal Workers, and the mail handlers, which was the union I was. But the mail handlers was taken over by LIUNA, which is a mob-controlled union. This is laborers. The shirt I have on, I brought that for a purpose. And laborers, in 1986, government did a big report, one of the 4 big mob-controlled unions in the country, right? So it's like willingly let organized crime come into your postal workforce, too. And this particular had much to do with the mail handler health benefit plan, which is second biggest in the federal sector. There's all kinds of entangling interest. But here's another thing that they did besides everything I've described, and this is crucial. The Postal Service, and there's a lot of this in the congressional record, they turned to a new system for working the mails, a hubs and spokes system similar to what the airlines run. They built 21 bulk mail centers. So I work in the bulk mail center. It was originally called New York International Bulk Mail Center. It's 10 miles from Harlem, 12 miles from Bed-Stuy, 12 miles from Newark, all these centers of black population, but it's in Jersey City where the public transportation is horrible, and they go from the New York City postal workforce makeup of 65%, 60% black and Latin, to 15% in Jersey City. Every bulk mail center in the country, they built 21 bulk mail centers. They're all named for big cities, but they're outside. The one for Chicago is in Cicero or Cairo, one of these places where the Klan marched, right? And it's a conscious turn to a whiter workforce. This is in the early 1970s, but you read in the congressional records, why did they do it? And you see these, it's code words sometimes. We got to go back to those workers we used to have, and things like that. But again, it's I think, consistent part of the, not that it can't be struggled against, because we did. We waged some very good struggle against it. But, so that's, from my own personal experience, one place. But overall, in answer to your question, I think for the labor movement, for working people, for people from below in society, we want to wage that struggle, class interest clear. We want on behalf of poor and working people, but we have to understand that white supremacy is central to how the ruling class maintains control. It's key to what they're going to use to try and divide us. We have to struggle against it daily, and we have to know, another key point Alan makes is how in the key periods, that's what they really turn to. So we have to be ready as we start having these overtures coming together. That's what they're going to come at us with and try and break us. So.